Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out today to Flyleaf Books, your local independent bookstore, and supporting these wonderful authors. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Michele Tracy Berger as she represents Doll Seed with Marjorie Hudson. Michele Tracy Berger teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at Case Western Reserve University and is the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities. Much of her work explores psychological horror, especially through issues of race and gender. Marjorie Hudson was born in the Midwest, raised in Washington, D.C., and now makes her home in North Carolina. She is the author of Indigo Field, Accidental Birds of the Carolinas, and Searching for Virginia Dare. We did want to start off with a little photo moment. I think the authors would love if anyone who has a book would hold up their book, and we'll just take a little picture.
My publisher will be super happy about this.
And with that, we hope you enjoyed the event. I'm going to turn it over to these wonderful ladies. And you can grab a copy of either of their books up front after the talk if you didn't already get one. I'm sure they'd be happy to sign after.
We are checking these mics. Is this on?
Yes.
It's on.
It's on.
Oh, it is. Wonderful. Michele, the day has come. Here you are.
Pinch me. Pinch
True.
me.
See, this book has been in the making for a while. I know that because I read some of these stories 20 years ago.
Not quite that long.
I don't know.
But a
I'm
decade
getting very
at
old. Everything seems a long distance. But yeah, I just want to introduce you in your writing life and let you talk about that a little bit. And how I first met Michele was one day she walked into my writing workshop. Some of you have been to some place like that in my workshops. And she walked into the back of the General Store Cafe in downtown Pittsburgh, and of all of us, she was the one that was foxy and dressed up because she had her Go Teach at UNC outfit on, and she was doing what all writers do. Any writers in the room, you do your job, but you wedge in the writing and you find ways to be part of a workshop. You find ways to fit in the writing before and after. So she was dressed and she sat down and she got into it. Right away, she was writing up a storm, all these exercises. And she told me later that she was really kind of at a place where she was discouraged. She just wasn't sure where she was going with her writing. She had accomplished a lot already. That this was really a way for her to focus. It helped her focus on moving forward. And I've always wondered what it was like for you. I remember what it was like for me to walk into that group and having been through, all of the processes and inspirations and, childhood reading that led you to that moment. What was it like for you that day? And what has your journey been like that inspired you to complete this work?
So thank you. That is, it just feels, I just have to say that it's a magical moment. For one, I want to thank Flyleaf Books and this wonderful community of UNC friends, folks, former students, new people I don't know. Just want to mark this moment. It feels like it's full circle because on that day, when I walked in my mind, it was kind of my last opportunity to connect and see if I could make this writing thing work. Because I was in my early 40s, and when you're in your early 40s, and I had been trying for a long time, I like to say that I was metaphorically in the basement because I would just write and rewrite a 400,000 word, yes, you heard that right, 400,000 word novel. And I kept thinking, I'm clever. Why isn't this moving along? And so by the time I came, and I think that's actually how a lot of us write, particularly a lot of women and or people from marginalized communities, that writing can be very secretive in terms of the fiction, and it takes a lot of vulnerability. So by the time I came to you, I kind of was like at this moment of breaking. And what was amazing about meeting Marjorie, so I walk in this room, I'm the only person of color, which is significant if you're a writer of color and you've been in a lot of writing spaces, and this is around 2010. And I just remember, and also as an instructor, and I have some former students in the audience, and I have to say, I take teaching really seriously, so I know what it means to set up a classroom. I know what it means to set up an inclusive space. So I'm thinking, I'm going to have to hold this space. This is before I fully sit down. And you, because of your incredible pedagogical chops, made me feel, I felt like I'm safe. I don't have to monitor the space. I'm comfortable, I'm safe, and Marjorie had a lot of street cred in Chatham County because she was known to be someone who was working on issues around diversity and was known to be doing work on George Moses Horton, the first African-American who was formerly enslaved to be published in the US. So that was all kind of the context. So I was actually able to settle in, which was really lovely. And then I was like, I want to get to know this woman. I want to know more. Like, mentor me, teach me.
So, but you actually had a very strong creative life since you were a child. Your mom really encouraged you in your creative life when you were young, living in New York City. Yes?
Yeah, so you asked a little bit about early writing influences. I would say, my mother definitely created the kind of imaginative space for me to grow as a young person. And so when I was very young, she turned over this walk-in closet and she was like, you can make it whatever you want. And okay, I'm going to date myself, but that's okay because looking at the ages of most people in this room, I believe that Will Robinson was my brother. I loved the original Lost in Space. You cannot tell me that Will Robinson was not my brother. My mother used to set a place setting for him. She totally was committed. So, that type of story really captured me. And the Bionic Woman. So space, we're going away, family, and then also strength. Very gendered Bionic Woman, but strength. And so those, and then we can talk a little bit about horror, but those kind of were early models for me. And everything I wrote just kind of came out a bit sideways. So I didn't, before even getting to the term speculative fiction, which we'll get to, that's just like what I got interested in at a very early age.
So you, when you would write stories, fiction stories in school and college, your teachers would go, huh, what is this? And they just kind of didn't know. But you remained encouraged and you remained happily different, I guess, from the literary mainstream genres, which I think is so great.
Yeah, well, in college, everything I wrote had some kind of element of speculative fiction, which we can talk about. And this is before now Marvel is cool and the X-Men are cool and people are talking about Afrofuturism. People were not talking about this in 1991, right? Like this was not kind of a standard thing. And in literature classes, it was definitely not a standard thing. So people were encouraging, but they were kind of like, if you could kind of write more of the traditional thing. I got a little bit of that going.
You got some pushback.
Yeah.
So why we're talking about this a little bit is because these stories are in mixed genres of speculative fiction, black horror, black speculative fiction, sci-fi. People say, the stories range from Octavia Butler influence to Ray Bradbury. So, Michele, you really taught me what speculative fiction was. I just knew about sci-fi and, Alfred Hitchcock magazine, things like that. I knew kind of the traditional, white people science fiction. And Michele has really educated me about how this is really a burgeoning and flowering genre, and it has some really kind of specific ways that it can shift perspective for the reader, which I think is really important and interesting. So, any, why don't you educate me a little bit more about these different genres that you're working in, and just let us know how you evolved to work in that language of those genres, and how you found your place in those genres.
Well, this is interesting. I mean, it's all fiction, right? But there's reader expectations, right, that also govern how we think about the work. But speculative fiction is actually a term that was coined in the 1940s by Robert Heinlein, and that was really about some distinction between kind of the pulp science fiction and other kinds of ways of thinking about the world. It then kind of goes away and then gets picked up in the 1970s by others who distinguish it again from kind of hard sci-fi. And then by the 2000s, Margaret Atwood picks it up and claims it as like that speculative fiction allows us to think differently, and it's not just about alien contact or Martians, right? That it gives us another way. But it's an umbrella term. So you got magical realism, horror, science fiction, fantasy, experimental. You can, weird, like a lot of things get classified under it. I just basically say it's from what we understand about the world as we know it now, the rules that apply can get broken in speculative fiction in some interesting ways. And the cosmologies of what we know, particularly I think sometimes Western cosmologies of what is possible, that can get broken in speculative fiction. Now, for me, I feel like I'm writing across the African-American literary tradition and the feminist speculative fiction tradition. And that's really important to say because Black people have been speculating about their experience in the US and in the Americas for a long time. And many of you already know. I didn't know this until recently. W.B. Du Bois wrote The Comet, right, in 1920, which is an amazing story about something catastrophic happens. It's set in New York City. African-American man and white woman find themselves, so they think, without anyone else around them. And they kind of, in the story, kind of work through their presumptions about who they are and who each other is. And then at the very end, spoiler, some people live, the woman's family live, and they don't take too kindly. Like they're back encased in kind of a racial identity. And so, and there's Pauline Hopkins' work. So actually Black people have been thinking about what does it mean around identity, around culture for a really long time. And so I think it's important to say that because it locates it then in this much broader context. And if we think about on the African diaspora, griots and people who were oral keepers who talked about stories and kept stories, also speculating. So I like to think that it's a little bit broader than where we start. So it always depends on where do you start. Does that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, one of the things that I see in your work and other work like this is that it allows the reader gets to look behind the curtain to because there's a sort of subtle critique and awareness of our culture and its strangeness and its flaws. And so there's this kind of peek into, oh, by the way, we're telling a human story, but then this woman's family show up and they don't like the situation. So there's always that context, that culture context that gives us a chance to have a window into to a very real world of fears and yearnings and bewilderment, secrets, the things that are happening in our culture around race and other differences. So,
and can I just add that horror is also a feeling. It gets segmented into a genre, but how many people watch Succession or know anything about Succession? That's a horror show. Like there's dread, there's terror. It's just, in the context of a drama. So horror also is about looking at how the other is portrayed and thinking about all of that, just exactly what you said. And I always like to tell people, besides watching The Bionic Woman and Believing Will Robinson with my brother, my mother is a huge horror fan. So she read and she went to shows, horror movie shows. And like many Gen Xers, I saw a lot of things that were inappropriate to see. So she took me to see Jaws, and I think it was like 7.5. And 20 minutes in, she's in my lap covering her eyes, and I'm rooting for the shark. I mean, how could I not grow up to be a horror writer, right? Like, but seriously, like, you know, by the time I was 7, I already knew, I had a sense, the world is a dangerous and complex place. And there's something about horror that allows us to understand that and go and sort of fight that. And now horror is, in terms of black horror and horror that's what people are calling elevated horror, social horror, that it's really looking at the systems that have been impacted. That's the real monster, as opposed to like something, you know, hiding under the bed.
Very appropriate for our moment, and I will say no more. Let's dig into stories. Let's dig into the stories. The first story in the collection is, I keep calling her Nusia, but she might be Nusia.
No, Nusia.
Nusia? Okay.
Yeah, Nusia.
Nusia is a story about a young woman, a young teenager in her family is Black, and she has an older sister who's a teenager, and she feels a little, you know, out of it, not getting much attention. And one day she writes an essay that wins a national award that allows her family to host a foreign exchange student from a different planet. Big deal. I'm going to have a new best friend. I'm going to be a little famous. I'm going to be, interviewed by the press. They're sending us to the White House. So it's her dream come true, this darling girl. But it's really not. She's thinking E.T., but this is the anti-E.T., as Michele coined that phrase, so I had to use it. So tell us a little bit about that story. And one of the things, if you were here early, you might have heard some disco music in the background. That's like a secret passion for both me and Michele. Don't tell anybody. And it's in the story with the kids dancing at a party. So that's in honor of Nusia and the dance party. So tell us a little bit about this. I mean, it's a little bit more Ray Bradbury, but there is horror in it for sure. I would say it's the story.
And thank you for that setup. I would say it's one of the closest to kind of a hard sci-fi story in that there's alien contact. I like to think of this as my E.T. meets Fatal Attraction, for those of you who are old enough, because it doesn't go the way Lindsay thinks, obviously. And the story is also really about, it's set in the late 70s. What does it mean to be the first? So they're the first Black family to host this alien, and the pressure on them, on this kind of normal family, begins to kind of eat away at them. And of course, it doesn't turn out quite the way Lindsay thinks it's going to, because Nusia has her own aim. So maybe I should read a little bit of
I think you should read a little.
Okay.
Yes.
Nusia. I said her name until it became a song. Soon after the decision, the exchange committee sent us pictures and information about Nusia and her people. I had read a lot about the Phyke already, so I skipped most of the background on them being humanoid aliens. But I studied Nusia's picture. She was beautiful. In the picture they sent of her, Nusia stood out against the backdrop of the Black River Ridge, majestic mountains in the background, and the sky dusted with yellow clouds on the southern tip of her planet. Her blue tunic played off the deep amber color of her skin. Flipping the customs and traditions, I found more about their suricil, or head covering in English. The most striking characteristic of the Phyke was the contrast between the iridescence of their suricels and the darkness of their eyes. The suricel was made of thick cartilage, which was covered the top of her head and came down to just above her eyes, the place where we humans have eyebrows. When I looked at her suricel, a peacock eye shimmered back at me. Phyke suricels fall off in adulthood and are replaced by less luminous skin. This phase was called the time of awakening because Phyke went out unprotected into their world. Their physical self was biologically and literally changed. They took on a different identity within their community. Although our ages didn't correspond directly, Nusi was considered an adolescent by Pfeiffe standards. That is, an age when she was to practice under guidance from elders for the awakening. She was making a great sacrifice by coming to Earth. I should have thought more about this fact, this price. At the time, I had no idea what she was giving up.
So,
early
yeah.
in the story.
Yeah, I love how Michele has created this otherworldly being and this whole planetary system, including the names of the mountains and so on and so forth. No, you're right there in the story. Yeah. Oh, okay. We're probably going to go a little later than we thought because we're just getting started here.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
All right. We'll move along.
Yeah, let's move along to.
And can I just say one other? I'll just say
sure.
one other thing about
Yeah.
that story. So, we're all influenced, writers, creatives, by different things we hear. I don't know if some of you remember Paul Mooney, who's a very well-known, very spicy comic. He did a bit basically that if E.T. had landed in a black neighborhood in the city, E.T. would have landed up in a pot of greens. He said that. He was spicy, but he also said, he kind of also was making a point. And I'll paraphrase, but basically he's like, oh, isn't it interesting in that film that no one has a problem being with aliens, and white people don't have a problem taking in this alien, but then they have a problem living with people of color. Mm-hmm. And he said that in the 90s, and I sort of never forgot that. And if we think about also histories of racial segregation and residential segregation, and so that somehow was in the back of my mind, and this is the story that came out.
I can see that. So let's move on to the title story, Doll Seed. So this is a story that it won the Carl Brandon Kindred Award in 2019 when it was first published, and it works in this, I guess, genre. There may be a whole genre of stories about creepy, toys and dolls that come alive that are a little bit creepy at night after the shop owner goes home in the antique store. I know that there's more to it, though. It's actually based on a historical, sociological experiment about dolls and race in the 1950s. So I'd love you to tell us a little bit about that experiment, and maybe read a little bit from the scary doll opening.
So, dolls are just interesting and creepy and beautiful, and so there's something about dolls I find interesting, and obviously they show up a lot in horror films for different reasons. So this story, and I would say the collection itself, just because I didn't say this earlier, it has flash fiction, it has a little bit of everything. So it has longer stories, shorter stories, compressed fiction, and you get a little bit of science fiction, horror, and this I would say is more alternate history / contemporary fantasy. And I just got really interested in thinking, because I think speculative fiction allows us to think about history and memory and what do we remember, how do we remember things. So the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision was based on, part of it, the decision to dismantle legal segregation was based on psychological research done by Kenneth Clark, an African-American psychologist, and his wife. And they're famously known as the doll test study, where they took dolls, black and white dolls, and they asked black and white children to pick the dolls that looked cleaner, nicer, friendlier. And so, which is interesting to think about a landmark decision that was based on social science research. And a lot of science fiction actually looks at experiments. But I just thought, well, what happened to those dolls? I mean, great victory, and hopefully we can keep that going. But what happened to those dolls? So it allowed me to think, what was the inner life of the doll? What did it feel like so in this story, there's sort of spirits that come into these dolls, and there's dolls and you'll love it because there's a hierarchy of toys. The toys don't like the dolls don't like the toys. And that all kind of happens at night. But I was really interested in how do we remember the 1950s, and what does it look like to remember it through these dolls? And so Shavella is the character that we go through her experience of prior to being in the Brown versus Board of Education experiment.
Oh, wow. So Shavella is such a dear soul, a doll searching for a soul, and her nemesis, the Missy dolls, are so mean.
The Missy Anns.
The Missy Anns. There's some mean girls in these doll stories. So, would you like to read to us from the very first couple of paragraphs?
I was not. Give me just a second, because I was not. I was going to read from this, but I'm so glad they asked me. Doll Seed, 1952. She stood in a brass doll stand on the window shelf in Mrs. Lovey's Irresistible Toys and Candy Store, looking out on 8th Avenue and 72nd Street. The casual passerby would have easily missed the momentary gleam in the doll's eyes. She awoke that day and named herself Shavella because that was the only word she could remember from the old language of the doll world. She didn't remember much of her life before. All she had now was the rubbery plastic odor of her, the mahogany sheen of her doll skin, and the intense yearning for love that yokes all doll forms to the human world. A sharp voice pinched into her newly awakened mind. "The new one's here. Finally, your body's been sitting around forever. Didn't think anyone would come." The voice continued. "I'm Missy Ann, number 13. Little girls always come in and touch me. One time a Negro girl even tried."
So it goes on from there. I think Shavella's greatest ally is a dump truck. So everybody, gets at least one ally in this world. Shavella is so, it explores the intimacy that children feel about, the inanimate objects that they love, their dolls that they invest with all kinds of emotion, and how that human relationship really sparks, in this imagined world, sparks a yearning for a soul and a yearning for a deeper life. So Michele has created this whole world: the before life, the middle life, the afterlife, the doll seed, the spark, and all of the creatures in the Missy Anns. I just want to say they kind of have their due. They get their, at some point.
And the Missy Anns, this may or may not be culturally relevant for some folks out there, but I remember my mom, and in some aspects of the Black community, people would say, "Oh, you're acting like Missy Ann. Who do you think you are? You Missy Ann?" And that was really a reminder of a particular kind of performance of white femininity. So with the Missy Anns, because there's like Missy Ann number 1 through like 50, right? So like I get to play with the numbers, but it is about an enactment of how they are being perceived and who they think they are at that time period. And so that was fun. And it took that story, I often say this to writers, sometimes you are writing ahead of the curve. So that story I worked on, developed, sent it out, and refined it, got feedback, but it took me probably 8 years. And by saying that, I'm not saying like, well, the story was so good, they should have accepted it, like right away. There's been a lot that's changed in the last 15 years in the publishing world. Different gatekeepers, different sensibility about, what counts as good literature. And so I feel I always say, like, believe in your ideas. Like, I believed all in the story. So then once it got published, it got the award the next year, and then it got reprinted in one of the top, sci-fi journals. And so there's and I think you taught me that. I mean, I feel like
99 rejections.
Oh my God, 99 rejections. Okay, you should tell them about what that means.
Okay, just very briefly. you need to get, I mean, the big accomplishment in a beginning writer's life is to get the 99 rejections. Because once you've got those, for one thing, they have to capitulate, and they probably have published you by then. But it's really the act of submitting that makes you a published writer, and we forget that sometimes.
And can I tell the story? Even we're going off script a little bit. I'll just say real quick. So Marjorie did this amazing workshop, something like, I don't remember the name of it right now, but sort of like living the writer's life or something. And she talked about this 99 rejection thing, and I was like, because I had been working with her for a couple of years, and I thought, of course I have 99 rejections. I mean, that's not why I'm not published. That I don't have 99 rejections. So I went home and I counted, because I was like, surely I'm submitting. Of course I have 99 rejections. And by and large, I think I might have had 50. In my mind, I had submitted so much and gotten so rejected.
Because it feels like, I mean, you feel every one of them, right?
Yeah, and so I really adopted that. And it changed my life.
Changed your life. Well, so 99 is such a big number, but it's not if it's your goal. Turns it on its head, which you need to do. Well, I think we should move on to another story, and it incorporates history. This is Black History Month, after all, and it incorporates history and horror. And one of the things that Michele likes to say is, it's a quote from Deanna Rivdu, Black history is Black horror. So when you're writing, about Black history, you might be writing in that genre, even if you're writing straight history. In her story, Etta, Zora, and the First Serpent, we have Spirits Rising, we have Zora Neale Hurston, and we have the Cotton Club. How did all this come together for you? And tell us about your family relationship to that dance club in Harlem.
So one of my other loves is dancing. And in this story, I was able to take dancing, Zora Neale Hurston, and the Cotton Club together. And Zora Neale Hurston, I just am fascinated by her. She's the first African-American woman to get a PhD in anthropology. Larger Than Life was written out of the canon until Alice Walker and a few others in the 80s and 90s recovered her. Was an incredible writer, believed in uplifting many different aspects of what it means to be Black in this country, way ahead of her time. And my grandmother danced. She was a hoofer, what they called a hoofer at the Cotton Club. And she was, couldn't sing, and actually really couldn't dance that well, but she was tall and light-skinned and pretty. And I grew up with stories about colorism and the stories that she told about how she was treated and how other people treated her differently given who she was. So I wanted to somehow find a way to put all of that into a story. And so Etta is a naive young woman who becomes entangled with Zora, who wants to find the first serpent. And she asks Etta to dance to help conjure up the serpent. What could possibly go wrong?
That's right. Would you like to read just a little bit from that story?
Etta knew that no one should talk openly about spirits. As she listened to the writer Zora Neale Hurston spin a tale to the room of guests, she also knew that this charismatic, 6-foot-tall, big-boned woman with a dimpled face was trouble, plain and simple. While other partygoers danced at the front of the apartment to the tunes of Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong, many were crammed in the back room, hanging on Zora's every word. She'd been holding court for the last half hour. Etta sat at a small round table on a hard chair squashed between two large men. She flexed and pointed her foot, as was her dancer's habit. She gathered that most of the people here were like Zora, writers, actors, spiritualists, strange people. She didn't belong. Etta knew about spirits, though, haints and night shifters from her grandmother and her own eyes. Her family grew up with a house spirit, a mean, frightening thing, loved to make bloodstains appear on her mother's clean laundry. Spirits weren't nothing to play with, and you damn sure didn't go to them. Her roommate had invited her to this party and then had the bad manners to leave early. She should have followed, but she couldn't take her eyes off Zora. No one could. I believe the devil is nothing but a clot of misguided spirits, like a hive mind. One is called the first serpent. That's who I want to find, Zora said. Stop there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So there's so many things we'd love to talk about that I want to open up to questions in just a minute. But I want to just say that, yes, there are very many flash pieces, very short stories in here, and a lot of them play on mythology or the gods of Olympus and all that sort of stuff, and make a little bit of fun of all those things. And one of my favorites, there's even an instruction manual like how to run the senior citizens event at the senior home for trolls, where they get to act out jumping out at people and dragging them under the bridge. Anyway, that's a fun thing at the senior troll facility. But this particular story is called Grinding Disney. I think you know all you need to know here. And I think I'll just ask Michele to read that story.
So this is the only story I've ever written that came to me almost whole in a dream. And I would really like to replicate that, but I don't. Grinding Disney. And I will say it's sort of the most experimental in some ways in prose poem-like. I have a meat grinder and I've brought it to this forest. Invitations were sent, and as the light fades, I see them twirl in, oblivious to danger. Leading the way is the fairest one of them all, the one who keeps losing her shoe, the one who went from mermaid to human, and the rest of the princesses and common girls assemble. Alice is last, the girl of elixirs. Can't we just admit that she likes to get high? Oh, and to my surprise, in floats Tinkerbell, the wannabe, more insect than fairy girl. I tell them that the meat grinder is a magical stagecoach, and that will transport them to a special realm called immortality. They trill at the lie. Longevity has made them a trusting bunch. I tell them they must disrobe, because the grinder will be hard enough to clean without shards of glass and cloth. They shed capes, headdresses, tiaras, and ribbons like the obedient girls they are. I confiscate Alice's flask. It's a tight fit, but I get them all in. Just when I'm about to turn the crank, Tinkerbell sticks her head out and asks, but why should we go to this land of immortality? They love us. They'll always love us here. Are you sure? I say. I don't really have a beef with her, and I'm about to tell her to go fly off, but someone pulls her down and she disappears. For a moment, I hesitate. Then I remember how sharp their candy-tipped swords were when they plunged them into our soft, young bellies before we knew our own dreams. They are smarter than they appear, which has always been a key to their survival, and their ability to adapt with the ages. Adaptation takes brains. I grind away and ignore their pleas for rescue. I watch. The grinder extrudes neat, mottled, pinkish ribbons, occasionally streaked with iridescent, shimmering scales. And with a pop, yellow fairy dust spurts out in place of the meat. Enjoying this more than I can say, I have not noticed that a crowd has appeared. Hungry. They know I do not belong to this forest. My spell casting falters. Hitting a dark beast on its snout, we fight for the fairy tale meat.
Whoa. So scary. there's a lot of power in these stories and a lot of perception. And I want to just open up for questions because I'm sure we've piqued your interest in lots of different ways. Many things we could talk about. So, questions for Michele? You've had some, yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. I know you primarily as a researcher, a different kind of writer. I'm hoping as I evolve as a scholar to write in new ways, not necessarily fiction. Has that been a part of your work? To write creatively, but not to tell stories?
So I want to repeat the question,
Yeah.
but I don't quite get it. So you're asking if Michelle's part of her process, you've known her as a researcher, is her process include sort of the creative work without storytelling per se?
Yeah. Like, are these two separate worlds, or do they blend together from time to time?
I think now, because I'm so much more senior in my career, I can play with form as an academic whenever I decide to do my next big academic project. But I think writing, to some degree, writing academically, writing creatively, there is a certain vulnerability that you bring to the page. Mm-hmm. And I think knowing how to do that, and I really also believe that it's about mindset as well in terms of what you bring to the page. But I feel like I'm not answering the question.
No, I think you are.
And I guess I can just say a little bit more about mindset. I was really naive in my 20s, like most of us are. I thought, I loved the life of the mind. I knew I wanted to be an academic, but I thought, I'll be an academic and I'll do creative work. Like, it'll all be fine. And then, advancing in my career, those feeling like they just did not fit in the same way, even though my academic work has historically been about more ethnography, so it has a little bit of the shape of storytelling. But for so long, I just felt like there weren't ways to integrate. So for me, it's just been more about integrating, because I love writing, whether it's academic or creative. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
I think, I think most people who do creative work as writers or artists or whatever have a job that pays the bills, and maybe another, a secondary passion that pays the bills. What is extraordinary is that if you feel the call to do creative work, you find ways to fit it in. And I know you've been doing work in community in so many different ways, as well as writing, 5 academic textbooks? Let's see, just for community's sake, helping with the new creative writing certificate program at the community college in Pittsburgh. Shout out to Karen Pullen, who did the foundational work for that. Thank you, Karen. Or serving on the boards of writers' organizations, especially the North Carolina Writers Network. Is anybody a member? If you're doing this creative work, you should be. Yeah. So, and so many other things. I'm amazed how she does it, but I think the creative work gives you fuel. What do you think?
Well, and something we didn't talk about, and happy to also have more questions too. That one of the things I learned from Marjorie is it's you need to be in community. That we have a lot of films that show artists as sole people running around, but really it's about the community. And the community is like rocket fuel. And so once I was in a group that I trusted, that really opened up so many doors. So I wasn't metaphorically in the basement anymore, by myself, just wandering around with my 400,000 word novel. I could actually get help us.
You were in the kitchen.
So, I moved up from the basement to the kitchen. So I think community and that's something, and I think that's something that even as an academic, I worked really hard to create for myself and others as writers as well. Like, I mean, I think fiction writers, poets, they already understand that. But in academe, there's definitely the sense of we have to do it all by ourselves, right? And so community is really important.
Gosh, yes.
I've got a question. I was really curious what happened to this wonderful long book.
The question is about the long book that Michele was talking about.
So I will say that someone who I'll just say, besides Marjorie, one of the people that I think has been, I know has been so supportive of my writing history and life is Mer Lafferty, who I think might still be here. Sorry to, yeah. And Mer Lafferty is an amazing writer. You should know her work. And she also runs a great podcast called I Should Be Writing, which is, you all should be writing. And I remember talking with her a long time ago, and so sort of, what's the heart of this? And I said, well, I started with a novella. And she's like, well, maybe you should start trying to send out the novella. And I was like, oh yeah, this, and long form had become popular again. And so I submitted that, and that became my first publication, which was Renew You, which is about what if a trip to the salon could kill you. Basically, it's what if an everyday virus was transmitted through a hair care product. So I'm deeply grateful for Mer's support in that. So the rest of the 400,000 words just is a trunk, like it's not to be thought of again.
Yes, sir. Wow.
So, Michele, as soon as you started reading, what jumped into my mind right away was that wonderful movie by Jordan Peele, Get Out, that was out a few years ago, that combination of dark humor and horror and themes of racial equity. So do you see yourself as writing in that vein, and do you feel that any of your stories, you would like to see them adapted for film?
Would you like your stories to be adapted for film?
I think both of us feel like we would love that. And
thumbs up on that.
Yes, so thank you for that.
Script
Yes.
writers, treatment writers,
yes,
we're ready.
For both of us, like we both have projects. So yes, it would. We're kind of going through this golden renaissance of horror. I mean, just in terms of at not just at the film level, but streaming services. So I think there's opportunities to adapt work. That's like a separate role in terms of doing screenwriting is very different, but I would love that. And I think, Lovecraft Country, Victor LaValle's work, there's a lot of people writing and doing amazing work in kind of this sort of new genre, not new, but rediscovered genre of Black horror. So Jordan Peele obviously has done it at such a level that it kind of opened up so many doors to think about this work. And I think he's doing amazing things still in the horror genre. So yeah, so that opened up, yeah. And I feel like I'm writing in that, tradition of Walter Mosley, if people don't know Walter Mosley, who writes science fiction, and kind of all, like I want to claim all of them. Mm-hmm. And, and many of you also know this, but I think it's worth saying that Toni Morrison's Beloved, it's really an elevated ghost story. I mean, it's a speculative story. It's not taught that way often, but it's really, when you look at the context of it, it's just done at a very high level. So,
and in the human story in Beloved, or in any ghost stories, in any speculative fiction stories, they're the stories we attach to, but their context is just, as you said before, the rules can be broken. Some interesting. Any other questions about Michele's work, or where is she going from here? I didn't know she's been on book tour to San Francisco, and you're going to LA. You're going to be at AWP, if anybody's going to AWP.
And should we say something about micro communities?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
So, we mentioned earlier, Michele is, and writers really have to work in community. As I tell my students, this sort of hackneyed story, but Hemingway had a writing group, it was Gertrude Stein and so on. We need those kinds of communities, and we need to foster them. And but what happens when we go on book tour? we sort of, we lose our people because we're out finding new people usually. And we're often in places that are, there's that fly again. I think that's a spirit. It's coming. Yeah, we've been encountering. We find ways though to create micro communities when we're like we are tonight, where people are listening to our work, and there are these sudden connections and there are these sudden insights a lot of the time that can feed us as we go through the process of shape-shifting from our introvert side to our public presentation side. So did you want to say anything about that?
Well, so you put that out there. So when I called up Marjorie like a year ago and was like, okay, what do I do? What do I expect? Like, because when Renew You came out, it was much more, I did a lot of academic talks and other things. I didn't do kind of a book talk. Plus it was a novella, very different than having a collection. So I was like, what to expect? And Marjorie was like, oh, you're going to, like, micro communities will just emerge in different places. And I think the thing that helped me most is thinking about letting go, right? Because we have so many, and I'm an extrovert. I don't like this characterization. All writers are not introverts. I mean, no, I know, not you, but I mean, like, people think that. I'm like, no, I get energy from people. But this thing of like letting go and being present. So being present for the people who are so gracious to come out, people that you may know who are there because they are supportive of you. They might not really care about the work. Being excited about meeting former writers that you used to know and reconnecting new writers. So that term that you gave me really helped me be open to whatever experience, and then to be like, it's not about me, it's really about the work and connecting and seeing what people are curious about. So I love that micro community.
Yeah. It's just that in any room of people who are listening or sharing in discussion about creative work, or living into the work just by hearing a few paragraphs, you have the opportunity to participate in creative community, which is really important in this world, I believe, and it can fuel the extroverts just as much as the introverts. And I have that.
And so maybe I'll leave people with one quote as we're finishing up. It's a quote that I really love. Of course, let me see if I can find it real quick. So Zadie Smith has said, writing is a confidence game, and the trick is to convince yourself. And so, Marjorie, I want to thank you for being a believing mirror and supporting my work for so long. It's just been lovely to be in conversation, and I want to thank the audience and thank Flyleaf again. This has been so lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.